Alrighty, guys. So today we're going to talk about real estate appraisals. We've gone through the process already previously in lecture, and so today we're just going to expand upon what you know about appraisals. Now, the first of which is that when we look at appraisals, typically you're in a situation where there's financing involved. And that means that basically the buyer is using a bank or some sort of lender. They're not using their own money, they're not bringing cash. And with that, the bank is going to make sure that the property that they're loaning money on is worth what the contract price is. So, if you enter a contract for a property that's $100,000, the bank is going to want to make sure that the property is worth $100,000 for their investment. The other case of where we see appraisals is in the event of a seller who has a property that is very unique, and so it's hard to get an idea of what that property is worth. And so you might have like an old Victorian house in downtown Gatesville, or something similar where it's hard to find a listing price, and in that case it may be better just to have that expert come in and give you a good idea of what the value is there. Alrighty, so when we look at appraisals, first of which, this is going to be an opinion of market value. Essentially, we're looking at the most probable price the property will bring. What is this property going to sell for? And in this, we are assuming that both the buyer and the seller are motivated to be there. So the seller wants to sell, the buyer wants to buy. We're not holding a gun to anyone's head and requiring them to do what they're doing. Both parties are also going to be very well informed, so that way we know that the seller is understanding of the market value, as well as the buyer who is not going to pay oogles more than they really need to for the property. The property's also been on the market for a reasonable amount of time, and that includes on the open market, so it's not a pocket listing. And then finally, when we look at these appraisals, we're assuming that there are no financial incentives as far as special financing or sales concessions. Essentially, the seller's not throwing in a new Camaro in order to convince the buyer to buy the property. Now, appraising is actually defined as the act or process of developing an opinion of value. That appraiser is going to look at the property's unique characteristics, and then they're going to take those characteristics and they're going to compare those to a similar property, and then come up with an idea of what their subject property is worth. Essentially, it's an unbiased look at that market value. What we do as real estate agents and brokers is going to look at the real estate valuation. And so essentially an appraisal is not going to be the same as a current market analysis or a CMA. They're two very different things. And as we get further into the lecture, you'll see you're required to actually disclose that you're not an appraiser. You don't have that license, and so you can't do an actual appraisal. So let's start off with the appraisal process. When the appraiser starts with an appraisal, the first thing they're going to do is state the problem. So they'll look at the purpose of the appraisal, and then they're going to look at the method of valuation and go from there. So if you remember back to my brokerage's property, it's a single family residence that's on Main Street, right? So it's currently zoned as a single family residential property, and it fits well as a commercial property. And so in this case, if I had an appraiser come in, if I was getting a bank loan through as my brokerage to buy that property, I'm going to have an appraisal done. And when they do that, they're going to look at that purpose of that appraisal, and they're going to say, hey, look, this property is zoned single family residential. However, the purpose of this appraisal is for a commercial property. So we're going to go out and we're going to look at comparables that will take into consideration that transition to a commercial property and evaluate from there. The second step in the appraisal process is going to be to list the data needed as well as the sources. And appraisers are going to list only what's necessary. We can actually note that we're getting these from official sources. So the tax records that we've talked about are hugely necessary, as well as the MLS. Those are our go-to tools to finding information. Third up is we gather, record, and verify data. And this is going to be broken down into general data versus specific data. General data is about the region or the city. It's going to look into the economic, the political, and even the social factors that are influencing that area. And it will also look at how that might affect a property's value. So for example, we see that our values here around Fort Hood are going to be very dependent on PCS season or redeployments. And so we're going to take into consideration all of that information. We've even talked about, when they come up with BRAC talks for troop reduction, troop level reductions. And so those typically have an effect on our home values because obviously if people may lose their job, they're less likely to enter a 30-year note on a home and sandwich themselves into that payment, not knowing if they can pay it every month. All right, and this is different than specific data, which is going to look at the improvements of that specific property as well as the lot from different perspectives. And we'll talk a bit about that in the future of this lecture. As well as we're looking at data from different approaches. So again, we're going to verify our data with at least two sources, and that's mostly important. Keep in mind any data that you use in your CMA, you need to get from an official source too, just because you can be held liable for the data you use. So it's important that you can prove where you got it from, whether that be an appraisal or a tax record. Just keep that in mind. All right, so fourth, we're going to ask, what is the highest and best use? And so appraisers always ask this question. It's one of the basic tenets of appraisals, and that is they're going to look at the property and say, what is the highest and best use from a legally possible, financially feasible, physically possible standpoint. And so, if you have a single family residence that's better off being commercial, we're going to answer that question and say, hey, the highest and best use of this property is to be a commercial property, despite what it's currently used at, which would be a single family residential property. We'll determine value based on three different approaches, and that is the cost approach, the sales comparison approach, and then the income approach. And then finally, an appraiser is going to report a final opinion through a formal report. And this is important to note. Since April 1st of 2009, the Uniform Residential Appraisal Report contains a market conditions addendum. And that includes environmental conditions. So if you've ever bought a house, pull out your appraisal that you got, or you most likely received and paid for, and look at that market conditions report, because you'll see there the appraiser is going to list out what's going on in the economy of that local market. And it's a pretty neat thing to look at. And if you're wondering where this came from, so it was basically born out of the market implosion that began in late 2007. And essentially, we've talked about it before, but at that time period really made quite a few lawmakers reflect on how that situation could be avoided in the future. The answer, again, was the Dodd-Frank Act, and that brought more consumer protection to the lending practices, which in turn obviously bleeds over into the appraisal process. So that's why we have it. With that said, lenders cannot bribe, extort, do all of those illegal things uh, to appraisers in order to inflate property values. And that's also going to include brokers as well. So you can't, offer an appraiser an extra $500 to make sure that that appraisal comes in at your contract price. Agents and mortgage officers can't select an appraiser, and even the lender staff cannot order the appraisal. Instead, what they do is they go through an appraisal management company. So essentially, there are different types of loans we've talked about, like VA loans and FHA loans. And when you have these, you have pools of appraisers that will go out for these types of loans. And so a lender will go through a computer system and they'll send a request for an appraisal. That request for appraisal goes to the AMC, or the appraisal management company, who is randomly selected, as well as that appraiser who they represent, and they're randomly selected in that pool of approved appraisers for that loan type. And then that appraiser has so long to go ahead and get that appraisal done. I believe it's about 14 business days. They can turn it in later. However, if they do, they have to have a really good reason why. So most of the time you'll see that appraisers are going to go ahead and get it done in time. And with that said, as an agent, it's important to know that your client may be paying, if you have the buyer, they may be paying for that appraisal up front. So you want to get through your option period and make sure all of those repairs are negotiated before you order the appraisal. Worst case scenario, you order that appraisal and the seller and the buyer can't agree on repairs, and so the property drops out of contract, but the appraisal's already done, and then the buyer has to pay $500 for an appraisal that they're not going to use. With that said, AMCs are going to recruit, qualify appraisers, all that good stuff. They have to register with the TALCB if they're managing appraisals on 5-unit or less residential properties. There are exceptions there. That's just a tidbit of information. I would likely not see that on a licensing exam. All right, so that's going to take us to value. And this is going to harken back to our Unit 2 lecture. So you've already gone over a lot of this, and we're just going to kind of expand upon what you already know. So value is how we explain the worth of a property. And you'll remember that acronym DUST that we went through in Unit 2. Essentially, we're looking at the effective demand. So current times, right now, if you have a package of Clorox wipes, the demand is really high for those right now, where it maybe not so much 3 weeks ago. Utility is going to be our next characteristic. Essentially, what is something worth? Or what can it do? Scarcity, how many of those things are available, and then transferability, which we've talked about, and that comes to the transferability of the title. All right, so when we look at market value, I would highly suggest you review figure 14.4. And there are all sorts of different types of value, but appraisers generally look at market value. And essentially what that's going to be is an educated estimate made by looking at the recent sold properties that are similar to that subject property. So if you go into a subdivision and you want to see, what that property should likely sell for, you're going to look at the neighbors and say, okay, have any of you sold in the last 6 months? We're not going to go too far back because real estate changes all the time, which we're definitely seeing right now. And this is going to be different than the market price. Market price is what the property actually sells for. And so in times of, for example, pandemic, we might see that the demand really drops off. And so the price that, the property actually sells for is much less than the market value would be according to the comparables. Cost also plays a factor into this. It may be equal to the value, but in all actuality, it typically isn't. Where you do see it be very exact is in new home subdivisions where cost is typically right hand in hand with the market value. Um, Keep in mind that you should know what the definition of an arm's length transaction is. All right, that's going to take us to the principles of value. So the first of which is going to be the highest and best use. And essentially, for appraisers, it's always the use that produces the highest value for a property, regardless of its actual use. So if we go back to my brokerage's property, we purchased it as a single family residential property, and we got a really good price for it. But that property, now being commercial, is worth 3 times as much as what it was when it was residential. The second principle, which plays a huge part in what we do, is substitution, and that is essentially that the maximum value of a property tends to be set by the cost of purchasing a similar substitute property. So you go out, you're looking for a house, and you're going to probably look at a few houses before you put in an offer on a specific property, right? And you may decide, hey, I really like this subdivision. It's right next to my bagel shop. It's next to my gym, and it's a close commute to my job. And in that case, you may look at all of the available properties within that subdivision. Well, that same thought process goes into the principle of substitution. So, we're going to look at all those available options within that area, and you could substitute one for another, and they'll probably be pretty similar. All right, our third principle is, of course, supply and demand, which we've gone over extensively, so I won't bore you to death here with that here. But conformity comes next, and that is essentially that the maximum value is realized when the land conforms in a certain area. So, depending on the area that you're in regionally, let's take Maine, for example. We have our Cape Cod homes, and all of them have the nice cedar shake shingles. Or if you go to Arizona and you're looking at more of a stucco build house that you would expect in the desert type areas, or New Mexico is probably the better state to go with for that. Anyways, so if you build that here, it's going to stick out, right? Like a sore thumb. And so we see that value is highest when the property fits and the structure fits with what is typical for that area. All right, number 5 is going to be externalities, and that is essentially that forces outside of a property may have a positive or negative effect on value. So I listed a property 3 weeks ago, and it's not getting a lot of showings right now. And why is that? Well, guess what? Social isolation has caused a negative effect on the real estate market, because the CDC government officials are saying, hey, stay indoors, don't go out. And so that definitely plays a part. Or, if we look back to 2008 and we go to Detroit, where there were a lot of foreclosures, and we saw that there were foreclosures one after another on the same street. If you're looking at all your neighbors and all of those are foreclosures, and so the curb appeal is just going down the drain, it's really going to affect the value of your property as well. All right, anticipation is our next one, and that is that values may fluctuate based on something in the future. So you may buy a residential property saying, I think in 5 years, this whole neighborhood is going to go commercial. And you're anticipating that when that happens, those values will shoot through the roof. Well, that principle obviously plays a huge effect on the value. Another real-time example is that there is a good chance of Colleen getting a chemical plant out along as you're going to Florence, and that can have an effect on the properties out on 195. Okay, the next of which is going to be increasing and diminishing returns. Essentially, improvements to the property may increase the value of the property to an extent. So, if you have a 1970s house, ripping out that shag carpet and putting in some modern tile floor can increase the value of that property to an extent. And this tends to be a tricky spot for a lot of people. The next of which is diminishing returns. Obviously, if we rip out tile floors and we put in a really dated shag carpet into our new home, that may take away some of the value of our property. Plottage value is going to essentially be if you combine a lot adjacent to yours, so the lot next to yours, you buy that and you combine it with your property, it's going to increase the value of those properties. And that's because it's in demand. I can't tell you how many buyers I get these days that are just like, I really want my little slice of heaven, get me a ranchette, and it's really hard to find those these days. Plottage factor, the plottage factor plays a huge part in that. Definitely know the definition of assemblage while we're at it. Okay, the principle of contribution measures improvements based on the contribution to value and rate of return. So you might look at renovation projects and say, okay, I'm going to change out the bathroom, or I'm going to do a kitchen renovation, but you have to look at the real rate of return. How much is that going to bump up your value? And in many cases, it may not be worth the amount of money you put in. In fact, the single most important or most likely highest rate of return that you can get out of any household projects is actually to change out your front door. And that's because the curb appeal and that first thought plays the biggest role when buyers walk to your house. And so that front door really needs to shine. And front doors really, they start off at like $300. They can be cheap and they can be really expensive. And so we see that the rate of return is typically higher just because it's really cheap to change out a front door for $300 versus redoing a kitchen renovation. And so that comes from the factor of contribution. Next of which is going to be competition. And this is essentially if a property makes tons of profit, others are going to be attracted to that location. You've probably heard the old adage, money makes money. Well, it's true in that, if you're doing something that's making a lot of money, guess what? People are going to be looking and going, I want to make money too. And they're going to copy you. Lastly is change. And so I'm sure you are very aware of this one right now, but essentially conditions of properties vary. Change is here to stay. Nothing is constant. Whether we see natural disasters or market forces change, this is a fluid job, and so you're going to find yourself dealing with change all the time, and that plays a huge part of appraisals too. Okie dokie. The next of which we're going to talk about are the three approaches to finding value. And each of these is going to serve as a check and a balance for the other approaches. The first up is the sales comparison or the market data approach. And this compares a subject property to recent solds that are similar. You're going to add or subtract based on differing characteristics. And it's based on the idea or the principle of substitution. So we've talked about a CMA. This is the epitome of what a CMA does, right? In fact, that's where we got it from. So what we do see is that for adjustments, we're going to factor in the date of sale, as well as the location, any physical features that make a difference, as well as the terms and conditions of the sale. We're going to assign dollar amounts for any differences. And for the sales comparison approach, this is actually considered the most reliable approach out of all three approaches that you can use to find value. And that's because, believe it or not, you have real-time data that you can use to see, what this property is worth. REOs actually refer to real estate owned properties. So these are going to be your foreclosures, your bank owned properties. We use REOs in comparables because it's considered an arm's length transaction. And so those do affect market trends. If you have a ton of foreclosures in your neighborhood, what's going to happen to your value? Well, chances are it's probably going to go downhill fast. I have had appraisers tell me in the past that you should typically only use REOs if they are the norm for your subdivision. So if I go into your subdivision at any given time and there are 3 to 5 foreclosures, then definitely use them. If they are kind of abnormal and you typically don't see them in your subdivision, then I probably would not use them as a comparable in your CMA. Okay, that's going to take us to our cost approach. Our cost approach is actually the most reliable when we're looking at special use properties. Our special use properties are like our schools and our churches. And that's because, you know what? They don't sell very often, right? And so it's hard to get an idea of sales or any kind of comps, and they don't generate any income. So we really need to come up with a idea of the value, and that's going to be based on how much it costs to recreate it. Well, before I get there, the cost approach is also known as an appraisal by summation, and it's going to use the reproduction cost or the replacement cost. So essentially, if I purchased a lot and I built a similar structure on it, what would the value be there? Now, there are 5 steps here in order to get an idea of what it's worth. And first of which is that you're going to evaluate the land as vacant and available for highest and best use. I will tell you that part was actually on one of my licensing exams, so go ahead and remember this process right here. After you evaluate the land as vacant, you're going to look at the current cost of the building improvements, because guess what? Construction costs change all the time, and that makes a difference in the value. You'll factor in what we call accrued depreciation from physical deterioration or functional obsolescence. We'll talk about depreciation more in about 2 minutes. And then you'll deduct the depreciation from the building sum, and then you finally add in the land value to get a total indicated value by cost approach. For construction cost, you can either look at the reproduction cost, which is essentially if you created an exact duplicate at current prices, what would it cost you to create? And this is different than a replacement cost, where we're not creating the exact same structure, but we're creating something that's very similar at the current prices. We use this with older homes that may have things that are outdated, and so we have to eliminate that functional obsolescence, as we call it. All right, appraisers use 3 methods to find the reproduction or replacement cost. The first of which is going to be the square foot method. This is the most commonly used, and the appraiser, your book says that the appraiser uses measures from the exterior surface of the outside walls for the finished areas to get a square foot amount. However, I've typically seen only the tax appraisers use the exterior walls, the outside of the exterior walls for measurement. And that's because typically people aren't inviting in the tax appraiser to their house going, oh, sure, get a good idea of what, my square footage is so you can know exactly how much to tax me. Uh, Typically, we see appraisers in this sense, they're going to measure from the inside of those exterior walls. And so once they get an idea of the square footage, they're going to measure, or they'll multiply, there we go, based on cost. Our second method is the unit in place method. You break down the building and you base each separate item on cost. So how much is the HVAC going to cost? How much would the plumbing cost? How much would the electrical cost? This is what the flooring costs. And then once you get an idea of what everything is worth, you would go ahead and you'd add those together. It's similar, but slightly different than our quantity survey method, which is an estimate of the actual raw materials needed to replace the building, but it's also going to then include the indirect cost like labor. Okay, I promised you depreciation, so I am giving you depreciation. Depreciation is essentially the idea that the condition of a building affects value of the improvement. We have what we call incurable depreciation, and that is essentially, you've got something that can't be fixed. Curable depreciation can feasibly be fixed. So you might have something like physical depreciation. If you bought a house in 1900, it's probably going to have wood rot and, need some love in 2020, 120 years later. Wow, that makes me, ouch, that hurts to say. All right, functional obsolescence refers to something that's outdated, and so much so that it affects the value. So maybe you can remember the sweet 1970s kitchen. 1970s kitchens with their phone jacks. Those phone jacks are pretty obsolescent or obsolete now just because people typically don't have a home phone. We all use our cell phones. Or maybe you have one of those really sweet 1970s bathrooms with a carpet in it. Most people cringe at that thought now of having, your bathtub meet up to carpet. That would be another functional example of functional obsolescence. The third type of depreciation we talk about is external obsolescence. These are going to be incurable factors that may be economic or environmental. So maybe, you've been living in your house for 50 years, and when you bought it 50 years ago, the field behind you was just that. It was a farm or some sort of field that was completely vacant. And then you had a chemical plant come in and move in, and they've been using that land ever since. Well, guess what? That external obsolescence is definitely going to have an effect on your value of your property. The cost approach, again, is the best for special purpose properties. Keep in mind, you should know the definitions of what an economic life is, as well as super adequacy. Okay, that's going to take us to the income approach. Income generated can dictate a property's worth. So essentially, if you have a property and it makes you money, we can use that to decide what the property is worth. And we can figure out that value through a few different methods. The first of which is what we call direct capitalization. It's the most commonly used approach under the income approach. And essentially what you do is you estimate the total gross potential income for the year, deduct an average rate of vacancy and loss to get an effective gross income, and then you're going to take out your annual operating expenses to reach your net operating income. This will include your management expenses. It will not include any debt servicing. So if you have a loan on that investment property, that's not included here. Fourth, you're going to estimate how much that an investor would pay based on the property's class and type. Um, when we look at investments, there are 4 different types of classes. They run from A to D. Now, an A investment is going to be a property that's basically brand new. It's all pretty and shiny. B is just slightly old, or slightly older, but it's still in great condition. C is you're looking at 20 years old, and it's dated, but it works well. And then D is going to be your Bates Motel. All right, and from there, we can look at the rate of return, and we call that rate of return a capitalization or a cap rate. That's essentially going to be our net operating income divided by our sales price. Now you're probably thinking, well, this is all very fluid and I don't understand this. That's fair. When we look at investment rates, all of these are very dependent on your hyperlocal market. And so this isn't really something you should be doing until you have a good education in your market to begin with. Finally, the appraiser reaches that value by taking the annual operating income and dividing it by the cap rate. And from there, they'll know what the typical cap rates are for the neighborhood, and they'll be able to tell from there. Your book points out yield capitalization, and I'm going to stop you right there because yield capitalization is outside of the scope of this class. So if there's one thing in the book that I tell you you don't have to read on, it's yield capitalization. If you get to a point where you need to know about a property and yield capitalization, you need to get an accountant involved because they're the experts here. Okay. Gross rent or income multipliers are used with properties that are not bought with the intention of being income producing. So we can use the gross rent multiplier, or GRM, if we can use the GRM if we have a residential property, and essentially it's going to take the market value divided by the gross monthly income. The GIM, or that gross income multiplier, is used for commercial and industrial properties, and it's just it's the sales price divided by the annual gross income. Again, there are no fixed multipliers here, so appraisers typically use these informally to double check their work. Another formula that you're going to have to know is income is equal to rate times value, or IRV. Income is equal to rate times value. Keep in mind that these multipliers don't take into consideration tax situations or financing methods, and so that's really their major flaw. But it's a failing that they have. Also know what the definition of an expedited appraisal is. I'll give you a hint. It's a drive-by. All right, so after an appraiser takes all of these into consideration, they're going to reconcile, and that's essentially where they analyze and they weigh the findings of these approaches to check their final opinion of value. The final thing that we're going to talk about in Unit 14 is essentially that when we price a property through a CMA, we're going to do something similar to that sales market data approach. So we're going to look at 4 of the most recent sales, compare those to our property to get a good idea of what the subject property should sell for. These solds are going to be typically from the last 6 months. We're also going to look at the current competition because you want to know, maybe the property that you're about to list has some really dated house or paint colors. So if you were to have your client repaint the house, is it going to make a huge difference? Well, if all the other properties in the neighborhood for sale also have really hideous paint colors, it may not make a big difference. However, if all of the other properties in the neighborhood for sale have the new grayish paints or whatever is, popular for the time, then that may be an issue for your property once you list it. The appraisal again comes in during the sales contract, or what we call our purchase contract. So that means a buyer's already submitted an offer, the seller and the buyer have come to terms, and they now have a contract. That's when the appraiser comes in. If you list too high, you run the risk of the property sitting on the market for a while. And that can obviously hurt a property. Typically, people will see that properties are, if they sit on the market, the first thing they ask is what's wrong with it. So you really don't want to list you don't want to push the envelope as far as pricing too high. But with that said, you don't want to price too low, because then obviously your seller may lose out on income. Remember that there is an appraisal disclosure that's required on a CMA. So you'll always want to provide a CMA when you list a property. And again, you're going to definitely want your seller to initial that, showing that you've had them look at it. And with that said, that CMA has to have a disclosure that, hey, you're not an appraiser, you don't have an appraiser's license. And so if they're looking for an appraisal, they need to go out and spend the $500 or so to get one done. There's also what we call a broker's price opinion. It's a middle of the road approach, and it looks at the probable sales price. It typically includes more information about the market and environmental factors, kind of like what the appraisal does, but it's not a full out appraisal. You can do the BPO, or the broker's priced opinion. I will tell you, I've done a few of them in my career, and I have yet to get paid for one. So typically you'll have these asset management companies. So you have a company that has a lot of foreclosures on their books. They call you and they say, hey, will you give us a BPO? And you can do one. And typically they say they'll pay you. They don't. But you also have to provide a bunch of photos, and you have to do a lot of data crunching. So it's a great way to learn about the market, but it's really hard way to earn $50 if they actually pay you. All right, we've talked about what a seller's net sheet is, so I won't bore you with that here. Finally, what we're going to talk about are the appraisal regulations, and that's just since 1939, appraisers have had licensing requirements. They now fall under the Texas Appraiser Licensing and Certification Board, which was created in 1991. There are 4 classifications of appraisers licenses, and so I'll let you read that in your book. And that's it for Unit 14.